The purpose of the Innovation Summit is to really bring experts from around the state together to try to share ideas and information about issues that are facing counties in the coming year. It's been now 2 years since the legislature passed and the governor signed AB 109. Since that time, counties have been adjusting in many different ways. For example, we'll have a meeting on Thursday where the CAOs are going to be meeting to talk about fund distribution, which is always a fun topic for them, I know. Everyone always agrees on that. But questions about funding, questions about what changes need to be made. There have been already some tweaks to try to make it work better for both the state and counties. The newspapers have been all over the issue in terms of trying to track down, was this crime committed by a AB 109er or not, and what's happening with recidivism rates, and what do we do with the jails, and what's happening in community corrections, all those kinds of things. So this panel is brought together specifically to try to address some of these issues, but mostly to try to drive a conversation here amongst us in the room. So without any further ado, let me introduce our esteemed panel. Starting to my immediate right is Dr. Joan Petersilia. Dr. Petersilia, as you know, is California's preeminent voice from the academic world on AB 109. Her and her colleagues at Stanford Law School have been working on this issue really right from the start, and Dr. Petersilia will be our first, we'll get our first question and we'll kind of launch off. To Joan's right is Mary Butler, the Chief Probation Officer in Napa County. Thank you for being here, Chief Butler. We really appreciate that. They're doing some innovative things in part with in a public-private partnership with Behavioral Interventions and the GEO Group, represented by Cate to Mary's immediate right. And then moving down the line, we have Paul Mello from Hanson Bridget and Samantha Wolf. For those of you who don't know Paul, I've known Paul a long time. He was my lawyer on the PLATA issues when I was back in the day at the back in corrections when I was the secretary there, and really is the state's preeminent expert. Hanson Bridget, Paul and Samantha, the state's preeminent expert on not only litigation involving jails and prisons, but in litigation prevention, which we're going to ask them some questions about. So, Joan, my friend, let's talk a little bit about AB 109. It's been 2 years. I know that you've had recent reports that have dealt with conversations in the field. I know that you've had conversations with practitioners. I know you've been tracking the dollars. I believe there was a new study released by your colleague, Dr. Weisberg, on what the courts are doing. Why don't you start us off by, if you can, give us a little bit of information about what do you think is going well, and where are areas where people have some concerns, and how do you think the first 2 years has gone generally on public safety realignment?
Well, thank you, Matt, and I'm delighted to be here to talk about the research. As Matt mentioned, in fact, I actually was at a meeting of CSAC 2 years ago when I was thinking about pulling out a folder today. I realized that I pulled out the one that was handed to me when I spoke here about 2 years ago, right after realignment was implemented. And at that time, I talked about the need for data. And I've studied nothing else but criminal justice policy in California for the last 30 years. And I knew when the governor signed realignment that there were no dollars specifically allocated for an independent evaluation. It was, in my view, an oversight, but it meant that the private research community, us academics in various universities and private research, had to step up to the plate early on. About a week after realignment was signed, I called all my academic colleagues to come meet with me at Stanford Law School, where I am, and 90 of us showed up and tried to outline the various things that we could do quickly to start collecting data on how AB 109 was rolling out. Matt mentioned that I have recently, over the last couple of weeks, published the results of 2 research reports. We actually released our 3rd research report, which is published by my colleague Bob Weisberg on the impact of realignment on the court system and specifically judges. In 2 weeks, we'll release our 4th realignment report, which is the impact on prosecutorial charging and decision-making. And 2 weeks after that, we'll release our final research report, which is called correctional control, which is where have all the people moved, what are we really doing, and what are our projections moving forward for prison, jail, probation, and parole populations through the year 2015. So let me go back to talk about what Matt asked me to do. My 2 projects, the first one is called Voices from the Field, How Stakeholders View Realignment. And this was a huge project for me. It basically involved myself and 25 other persons involved in this project. We spanned out over California's 58 counties. We interviewed close to 130 police, judges, DAs, public defenders, victims, mental health workers, probation chiefs, parole managers, to ask them basically how was realignment going for them. And that report, normally, I mean, for some of you who may know my background, I actually am really feel much more confident with big databases. I'm kind of a quantitative researcher. I like numbers, and I don't do a whole lot of interviews. I always feel like, well, maybe I didn't get the right person, maybe that person isn't being totally honest. But in this instance, I wanted to get a real sense from the people that were actually implementing the law. How was this going? How was it going in their county? And what changes did they want to see made? And I actually, after spending pretty much 9 months in the field, interviewing all of these people, I became quite convinced that what I had found was really even stronger than quantitative analysis, because the results were so consistent across counties, across the particular actor, police, courts, corrections, that I actually feel that there's something there. Now, what did I find? Well, I guess I would have to say that the results were mixed. Certainly, there were counties where things were going much better than other counties. And when we looked at which counties seemed to be succeeding the best, it all depended on where they started from. You know, clearly, some of the counties, particularly, let's say, in Northern California, had a much less difficult challenge. They received fewer people coming back to them because they had relied less on prisons as a sanction to begin with. The people that they were receiving, sometimes as a risk level and prior record, were less serious, and they had what we were able to characterize as resource-rich communities to begin with. Take San Francisco as an example, since we're right here, or even Santa Clara. San Francisco received few people back because of the housing boom, et cetera. Very few parolees could afford, or even probationers could afford to live in San Francisco, so their numbers were small. Because of their relatively rich community and the current economic boom, they actually had fairly good programs to begin with for the mentally ill, the substance abuse, et cetera. So when realignment came, they were facing not as serious a situation, and their jail wasn't crowded. So when we interviewed in San Francisco, everything looked pretty positive. If you go to some of the other counties, particularly in the Inland Empire, things looked quite a bit different. Many more people coming home, much more serious, lack of resources because of the economy. They had actually cut police and social services prior to AB 109. So it really was a mixed bag depending on what county you went to. There was also between sectors. So we began, the original grant said that we would interview representatives of the community corrections partnerships. During the course of the project, we started getting calls from other groups saying, you know, we're a big part of realignment. Why aren't you interviewing us? This was particularly true with victims groups. We actually wrote a whole separate article, and all of these publications, by the way, are all available now electronically up on the Stanford Criminal Justice website. There's a bulletin that accompanies an executive summary, which accompanies each of these reports, which is 200 to 300 pages, which I'm sure you don't want to sift through. But we also wrote an article on how realignment was impacting victims. We've now also looked at the impact on municipal police, which we had not really set out to do. And what we found was, depending again on where you were looking, the police, most police, and again, these are averages, so on everything I say, there were police departments, there were sheriff's departments, there were probation departments where they said things were either going terrifically well, or this was the worst thing that California had ever passed in terms of legislation for them. But for the police, the results for the municipal police departments, which provide policing to 80% of all California citizens, for most police, realignment was not going well. They didn't feel that they were funded to the extent that they should have been. They felt that they were pretty much left out of kind of the policy discussions, and they felt that crime rates and what they were seeing on the ground was having an impact to their day-to-day lives, that they were spending a lot of time monitoring these new AB 109 offenders. The sheriff, we found, was mostly concerned about jail overcrowding, and I'm sure that we'll hear from the attorneys deal with litigation. That was what we mainly found, a lot of concern from the sheriffs about jail conditions. Many were overcrowded. As we know, 28 of the 58 counties actually had overcrowded conditions prior to realignment. The jail population was about 80,000 jail inmates prior to realignment, and it's increased about 8 to 10,000. So we are seeing some jails who were crowded beforehand. Again, they were often the most heavily hit. And so sheriffs are not only worried about conditions in jail, health care, how do you separate the more vulnerable inmates, avoiding litigation, long-term prisoners. Because one of the issues that people often don't recognize is while realignment changed the venue or the address where the inmate will serve once sentenced, it did not change the length of time that inmate could actually serve. So you can have jail inmates who are sentenced to 2, 3, 4, and even 10, 20 years have been some of the cases. So the sheriffs were primarily concerned about a new type of inmate as well as a longer term inmate, growing old, and healthcare and litigation that might follow. When we got to the court system, there were mixed views. District attorneys were the most upset about realignment. Public defenders and probation chiefs were the most enthusiastic about realignment. Finally, they felt that for public defenders and probation chiefs, they finally felt that realignment was the shock to the system that they had been asking for years. Probation has always been the workhorse of the criminal justice system. They've always taken on more and more and more and never been funded for it. And so they finally felt that while we had talked a good game in California in the last few years about delivering rehabilitation, we had never actually put our money where our mouth was. And so AB 109 allowed probation and public defenders to get rehabilitation as a serious topic for California counties. The judges and the district attorneys, but particularly let me say a moment about the district attorneys, were, I think, the most upset. We had district attorneys screaming and yelling at such a much different reaction than we had with the other people. In fact, they wanted a voice. They wanted to be heard about what this has done in their view. Of course, you've removed prison off the bargaining table. And the district attorney, often when you're doing plea bargaining, you're plea bargaining about prison or not, so the length of sentence. So once you remove the bargaining chip of prisons, you can see that the discretion and the lever that DAs and the court system has for a district attorney has been removed. They complained vociferously about their lack of discretion and how the discretion had now moved to the sheriff, so that many district attorneys, and we heard this a lot from judges, said that their discretion had now shifted to the sheriff, who had been given all the authority to release people after they had sentenced them to a term, to release people in order to keep those prison populations down and under the court order. But we had some judges that were very much in favor of realignment. So judges who were in therapeutic courts, mental health courts, veteran courts, drugs, substance abuse, juvenile courts, favored rehabilitation that was now made possible through AB 109. So we saw pretty much the gamut, but we did find that when we asked them, and how would you change it, everybody pretty much said the same thing. And this to me was kind of the hope going forward, was that not one person said we should repeal AB 109. Everybody, from start to finish, 130 interviews throughout the state, said we are heading in the right direction. We didn't want this, but the court gave it to us, and we're going to make it work. And that our previous system was very dysfunctional. It was bankrupting the state, on and on and on. So give us time. We will make it work. It'll probably take 7 to 10 years, but we need some tweaks. And they talked about realigning back some of the offenders, the particularly long terms. We had many people who suggested that people sentenced to over 3 years. But then we had some people who said over 6 years. So that seems to be the metric that's going around this state about people sentenced for very long terms, maybe should serve those back to prison. So we had some suggestions which we write about in the report. But to end here, Matt, I think that what we're seeing, and I certainly suggest this probably is what you're seeing in the county, is that this is a messy, difficult business. It's the most difficult thing that the California criminal justice system has ever been asked to do here. What I love is that we're starting to do it, I think, well. Our results took place in the first year. We went back and interviewed some of the people the end of the second year, and we saw a positive direction from the first year to the second year. So I think that's a hopeful sign, and hopefully we'll talk about some of that in the question and answer period.